I will be presenting the conclusions of the third phase of our study, which concerns the identification of best practices for accelerating company digitalization. So jumping straight into what we did and what our methodology was. If we can move on to yes, next slide. So first of all, who are these best practices that we developed for? Our target audience concerns all companies, but we've, in this study, put a special focus on SMEs and companies of average and below average digital maturity. This is important because it influences also our approach and the methodology that we have chosen, as well as the definition of what best practice even means. Of course, in a lot of research that we see, best practices are often linked with state-of-the-art technologies and innovative solutions. However, when we look at companies that may have lower digital maturity or are not so far along on their digitalization journey, what we see from case studies is that a lot of the time these companies actually benefit more from starting with simple solutions or maybe doing smaller projects to begin with, and only after they build their digital capabilities, moving on to more advanced solutions, more advanced technologies, as well as bigger transformations. So therefore, in the context of this study, we define best practice to be a behavior that facilitates digitalization regardless of digital maturity, company size, or technology, meaning that these behaviors would be applicable to all companies regardless of where they are in their digitalization journey. In turn, this also influences how we designed our methodology and what we did. Our entire methodology is based around collecting case studies, company stories of how they digitalized. And the companies that we looked at were very diverse in terms of their digital maturity, in types of technologies they adopted, in the extent and size of the projects they implemented. And therefore, we think that what we developed as the end result will be applicable to all companies, but especially will take into consideration the specifics of SMEs and companies who are not so far along in their digitalization journeys as well, which we think is important. So in terms of the steps that we took, we started by collecting company digitalization stories. In total, we collected 66 of them with the help of digitalization hubs as well as industry experts. We then chose from those companies the most relevant ones, the most relevant stories for the case of our study, and developed a total of 39 company digitalization case studies. The third step then was to use these case studies as a basis to define what were the behaviors and the lessons learned that these companies had as they digitalized that made them successful, that helped them successfully implement digital technologies. As a result, we defined 8 principles that we consider best practices of how companies can behave or act to successfully adopt digital technologies. Finally, the final step is actually today, this workshop. We are validating and elaborating these principles based on your feedback. So we really hope that for your active participation in the interactive parts of this workshop, for your questions, comments, feel free to drop them in the chat as well throughout the presentations. And we really hope to gather some feedback that will help us make sure that these principles reflect everything that is important and that we haven't missed anything during this process. So moving on to the next slide. Before I move on to the principles themselves, I wanted to also make a note on SMEs and digitalization. We hear a lot in other research as well as previous phases in this study about the constraints and obstacles that SMEs face when attempting to adopt digital technologies. You know, they face skill shortages and financial constraints very often, and we talk about how SME digitalization is lower than that of large companies. However, when we specifically focused our study on companies that successfully adopted digital technologies, we noticed that SMEs also have several strengths when it comes to adopting digital technologies that they can take advantage of. So for example, SMEs being flexible organizations actually is very important in their ability to successfully adopt digital technologies, because research shows us that the flexibility and agility of a company's operations and management practices is very important for it to be successful and adapt to changing market dynamics and consumer preferences, and to kind of readjust their plans as they move on in their digitalization journey. Similarly, the fact that SMEs tend to be more management-centric and have less levels of hierarchy in their organizational structure can lend itself very well to, fostering buy-in and making sure that if the management is supportive of digitalization, that this idea feeds down into the rest of the organization more easily than that could alternatively possibly be done for a larger company. So we thought it was important to highlight this, that SMEs not only face unique constraints or obstacles, but that they also have certain strengths they can take advantage of when it comes to digitalizing. So moving on to the principles themselves, here you can see a summary of all the principles. I will go one by one in talking about them, and you will see in the upcoming slides that they will contain some of the main conclusions we have from our research and from case study analysis, as well as examples from the case studies of companies who have exhibited these behaviors. So, here this is just a summary, but I will explain in more depth as we move on. Also, I'd like to note that given the time constraint, I may not be able to explain every detail that you will see on the slides. However, all of these presentations we have today will be made available after the event, so you'll have a chance to take a look at them after as well. So moving on to principle 1, which concerns management buy-in as well as agility that I already mentioned. So here we see that, especially in SMEs, but of course in all organizations, management buy-in and strategic alignment with digitalization is very important. It's one of the key determinants of successfully adopting digital technologies. But because of the importance of management, they can act either as a gateway or a gatekeeper for adopting digital technologies based on whether they are supportive and ready for the adoption and have the right mindset for adoption. So when the management is supportive of digital technologies, we see that this is usually cited by case study companies as a big success factor, and that such management are able to foster a culture that in the whole organization moves the company towards digital technology adoption and willingness to experiment and change the ways of working. However, when there might be a lack of management buy-in, we say the companies need to, try several ways to try to convince management that digitalization is actually something beneficial. And we saw different types of ways that companies approach this. So, for example, as you see on the screen in the Hungarian automotive company, where the management was reluctant to invest in technologies where they didn't see a clear payoff within 2 years, talking to other companies and seeing the best practices and the benefits that those companies have observed was actually, very beneficial to convince management that the chosen solution was worth implementing. Similarly, we see that, being aware of technology developments in other companies and networking with other companies can be a powerful tool to convince management that these benefits could actually accrue. And on the point of agility, here, once again, companies that are more ready to change the ways they work, that create a culture of experimentation and a sense of urgency for introducing changes, are also more likely to succeed. And we see this to be the case both in terms of smaller digitalization projects and smaller companies, where we have micro enterprises saying that the management being ready to change the way it works was an important driver of digitalization. But we also see it all the way to large companies implementing digital transformation programs. We see that, therefore, this kind of attitude and culture and agility that the management exhibits can trickle down into the rest of the organization and be very important in, supporting the digitalization efforts overall. Moving on to the second principle, which is very closely linked, as you will see. So fostering employee and third-party buy-in for digitalization. As I already mentioned, when the management is supportive, this tends to, influence the rest of the organization. But this principle more concerns how that can be done. So we see that, of course, the way the change management is done will depend very highly on the complexity and size of the digital transformation that a company is undertaking. Smaller initiatives and smaller companies probably will not have a huge change management formal program in place coupled with them. However, certain elements and principles are there in all cases or are necessary in all cases. There should be a clear idea on how the digital technology adoption will bring benefits to the company as a whole, but also to the employees working with these new technologies. Then those benefits need to be communicated with the stakeholders that are involved, both the employees who will have to use the digital technologies, but also what's important to note that in some cases, these may also be customers or other companies in the value chain if they have to engage with these technologies as well. We saw case studies where we had companies walking through their customers and showing them how to use the new technology they were adopting, because they needed to do that to make sure that customers accept it as the new way of engaging with the business. And then an important point here, of course, is also not just to have one-sided communication, but also of management informing what those changes are, but to also receive feedback and have the two-sided dialogue with employees and third parties on how the changes will be beneficial. And the final big point here is, of course, also monitoring and demonstrating progress is a key thing. Whether it's successful pilots, whether it's achieving some KPIs that were set for the digitalization effort, demonstrating that it's actually bringing the efficiencies or the benefits that were envisioned can be a very powerful tool in convincing people to support the further steps in the digitalization journey. So yeah, moving on to the third principle, and this is perhaps one of the more complex ones and the ones that we will engage with the most during this workshop. So setting strategic objectives for digitalization. Here we kind of have divided it in three main points. Firstly, technology and trend monitoring. We see from evidence that companies that stay aware of the different types of technologies and trends and possible opportunities for digitalization that are available are more likely to then also adopt the digital technologies. And here we see different approaches to that. Some companies will build this capability for monitoring trends and the knowledge necessary for that internally. But some companies will also kind of try to engage or rely on external experts or gain this knowledge from external experts, such as digital innovation hubs or support programs or existing tools that gather this information for them. So things like best practice collections, for example, can be helpful. The second point here is identifying digitalization gaps and needs. So of course, similar to the first point, awareness of what digitalization gaps there are in your company and how those could be filled by adopting new technologies, again, based on the case studies, based on the research, is an important step in choosing the directions where a company should be investing to achieve their strategic objectives in the end. Once again, we see that companies may be able to do this internally if they have the capabilities and the capacities, as well as maybe the tools available to do so. However, very often, what is also beneficial is seeking some type of external expertise, whether it's through public support, whether it's through external contractors, and using existing frameworks, maturity models, readiness assessments to make this assessment as objective as possible, and to also make sure that it's done from a methodological point of view in a way that is useful for the company. Of course, here, when we look at what the European Commission has been doing, the European Innovation Hub initiative and the digital maturity assessment that is part of it are also important tools that can be used for this purpose. Then kind of finally, the third point here, digital strategy. Here we actually find kind of two interesting views that are in tension. From one side, we see that evidence suggests that digital strategy and setting long-term strategic objectives and having long-term planning is important for successfully digitalizing. On the other hand, what we see from practice when we look at case studies is that often SMEs use their, agility and flexibility to be quite reactive in their digitalization and to adapt to changing external conditions rapidly, as opposed to kind of relying on this more long-term planning. Both are important and both have certain benefits. As I already mentioned, agility is very important when digitalizing. On the other hand, this long-term planning perspective is also something that is quite valuable. So we hope to kind of explore this tension a bit more during this workshop, including in our panel discussion. But I think the sort of simple conclusion is that, of course, companies should plan in the long term and should have some strategic objectives, whether it's in the form of mutual agreement between parties or a formal document, whatever works for a certain company and its digital transformation. But at the same time, it is also important to be willing to frequently review these objectives and to kind of recalibrate them if something changes in the external conditions or the internal conditions of the company. So moving on to principle 4. Of course, this one is not surprising for most people who have been engaging with industry digitalization questions before. Securing the skills needed. We have seen this in previous stages of our study appearing as one of the main problems many companies face when attempting to digitalize. When we talk about skills, and especially digital and hybrid skills of all levels, this is a challenge many companies face. And when we look at the case studies, we see that companies try to solve this in various different ways. Some companies build the capabilities they need to digitalize internally. Some companies, are doing something to upskill or reskill their staff, whether through formal training or by learning through doing. And in some cases, the companies are also relying on external support, whether in the form of public support programs or in the form of, external contractors. In these cases, we think that it's very important to then make sure that there is some kind of transfer of this knowledge and these skills from the external sources to the companies internally. And this is what we see the successful case studies also do. So we look at the examples included here. So the example from UK, we have a company that collaborated with academic researchers for knowledge exchange and expertise to build their own capabilities as well. We also have company from Hungary in the automotive sector. Here is one of the examples that kind of learned by doing in terms of digitalization without implementing, big training programs or hiring new people necessarily. But as they were implementing these technologies, they made sure to build those capabilities that they can use in future digitalization projects as well. And this is quite a common theme in a lot of cases. SMEs often don't have long-term planning also when it comes to digital skills needs. Instead, if they are investing in trainings, that is to respond to a direct business need or a direct business reality. The same is true for, seeking external expertise. And this kind of learning by doing process, while it is very valuable, once again, this is a question for discussion. Is the long-term planning, something that should be implemented more, and what are the ways in which to do so? So moving on to the next principle. Principle 5 concerns assessing the costs and benefits of digitalization and also ensuring feasibility. What we see from case studies is that, companies are often quite good at assessing the direct costs and the short-term costs and benefits of digitalization. But there's lots of sort of more indirect costs and benefits. For example, in terms of benefits, consumer experience might improve significantly, or their expectations might be met or not met by adopting digital technologies. And this is quite hard to quantify, as well as longer term effects, which again might be also harder to quantify, are sometimes not taken into consideration. Now, we have some examples of companies that actually, like with outside support, performed a feasibility study. You see here on the example from the textile industry in Romania. But we also have companies where, insufficient calculation of the costs of digitalization and the benefits of digitalization resulted in them failing to adopt a digital technology because they didn't consider all of the costs that would come with implementing it. So once again, we see the same tension as when we talked about digital strategy. Long-term planning and kind of extensive calculations would be beneficial, But then on the other hand, we recognize that, SMEs have limited time, have limited internal resources, perhaps, to do these kind of things. And so once again, the kind of conclusion here is that this is another area where external support can be very valuable for companies to make sure that their digitalization is successful. So, and this is actually something, we explore also in the second point here. Sorry, previous slide. Thank you. So with 5.2, we explore the idea of ensuring the necessary capacity to implement digitalization projects. So because we recognize that these resource constraints are a very relevant concern for SMEs, we see that companies that can leverage existing European and national support programs are often benefiting and are often ones that implement digital technology successfully. Now we can move on to the next slide. Thank you. So yes, sixth principle is implementation planning. So here, again, very similar logic as what we already discussed with digital strategy. There is a bit of a tension between, the need for long-term planning and the need for agility. And once again, we see that planning, often appears in research as something that is very important, that having milestones, monitoring KPIs, having, the division of responsibilities clarified, these are all important aspects. But because a lot of the time, digitalization is a reactive process to some kind of external or internal changes in the business environment, these things often, are not extensively planned. What is important is to consider, of course, that the level of planning and the level of detail that is put into this planning process in general will highly depend on the scope of the digitalization effort. So when we look at smaller digitalization initiatives, perhaps having an extensive plan to, just subscribe to an e-commerce platform may be unnecessary. On the other hand, if you're doing a whole of the organization large digital transformation, this will require relatively more detailed planning. And of course, when we look at the case studies, we see both kinds of examples. We see companies that, just quickly responding to a need, implement a digital solution within the scope of a few days or weeks even. On the other hand, we have companies, completely changing their business models to adopt new technologies, which is a completely, different process requiring a level of planning that is much more detailed than the smaller project. What is true in both cases, once again, though, is the need for agility and the need for, iteration. So the companies that are able to change their digitalization plans and to kind of adapt as they go based on the results of what they have learned while implementing smaller tests or experiments or certain steps within their digitalization journey are the ones that are more likely to be successful. So the flexible adaptation of plans and this kind of approach is what, often it leads to better results when digitalizing. And once again, we see this in several examples. The companies that, use this iterative approach, that test before implementing things company-wide, that have a culture of experimentation, are the ones that are kind of always citing these as success factors in the case studies as well. So moving on to principle 7. This is perhaps the most horizontal of all the principles we identified and probably not a surprise for anyone as well. So taking advantage of the wider ecosystem and collaboration, of course, is something that I already highlighted in some of the other principles as well. Because, SMEs are small companies, it is understandable that they will not have all of the possible expertise internally. So engaging with the outside ecosystem is very important in helping them along their digitalization journeys. And we interpret this ecosystem quite widely. We talk about public sector organizations, we talk about universities and academia, we talk, of course, about the European digital innovation hubs and innovation hubs, but we also talk about, other companies in the value chain and the more private sector players who can, share expertise and help each other in terms of adopting digital technologies, because certain benefits can accrue from, doing certain things in the same way along the value chain. So, for example, we have case studies of companies which adopted certain technologies when other companies in the value chain told them, oh, we're going to be able to collaborate better if we all use the same thing. So here we also have quite a few examples. You have two here highlighted on the screen. So one is an Estonian manufacturer of work clothing for the Scandinavian market, which cooperated with several organizations to implement or create a new prototype of their product, such as the Estonian ICT cluster, smart electronics cluster, and the university. We also see that a lot of the companies that we look at, as is the example with the German retailer of lamps here, we're engaging with like public support programs and technical support programs that are available within their country as well to help them in the digitalization journey. So once again, of course, this collaboration is a very wide-ranging principle, and I think we will definitely explore it in the panel discussion as well as in the interactive parts of the presentation of the workshop later on. But again, very important principle nonetheless. So finally, moving on to principle 8. I know it's a lot of principles we're covering today. So the final principle we developed and found by analyzing the case studies concerns choosing a solution and choosing and interacting with technology providers. So what we see from case studies is that a lot of companies consider choosing the right solution and solution provider as a very challenging process. They're often overwhelmed by the many options on the market, or vice versa, may actually not see options that are relevant for their specific needs on the market as well. For example, they might see that there's lots of very advanced solutions that are relevant for maybe bigger companies, but find it difficult to find something that would fit their needs and their price point and their resource constraints. So what we find is that, especially for SMEs, maybe for some companies that are resource constrained, there are often options that are less than state of the art that are relevant as well. And here we look into also low cost or so-called shoestring technologies that can be viable as well. These include things like open source technologies, off-the-shelf solutions, retrofitting of older machinery instead of buying new machinery. Here, a good example is the example in the middle of this slide, a logistics service provider that adopted AR goggles to guide workers, but instead of using the industrial solution, which was expensive and relatively more complex to use, actually chose to use goggles that were developed for commercial use for regular consumers like all of us, because those were easier for them to implement as well as cheaper. So in a lot of cases, looking at a wider range of solutions that are not necessarily the, state of the art, the most innovative, the most expensive, the most complex, can be very relevant for a lot of companies. And of course, once again, because SMEs especially, but all companies cannot have every type of capability internally, interacting with solution providers is usually the way to go for a lot of companies for adopting digital technologies. And here we see that the interaction models between the solution providers and companies are very different in terms of their extent. Like where companies sometimes adopt, let's say, an off-the-shelf solution, they often will face a relatively hands-off approach. On the other hand, we see that there are companies that go all the way to, creating very close partnerships with solution providers and finding kind of win-win situations for each of them. An example here is the example you see on the right. So from Portugal, we have the company that specializes in knitting sustainable fabrics. And to create a quality control system for their garments, their textiles, they cooperated with a startup that didn't have a ready working solution yet, but that wanted to test their solution that they were currently developing in an industrial setting. As a result, the startup that provided the solution could test it. And this company, this textile company, was the first to be able to implement it once it proved successful and once they developed it to a working model. So, of course, these kind of partnerships are, again, an example of interacting with your ecosystem in a mutually beneficial way. So this is all for the examples. I know it's a lot of information, and of course, once again, this presentation will be available after. But I would like to hand off to the colleagues and maybe some questions as well.